everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today we are going back to basics and exploring some of the most common terms you'll want to know if you want to get started with kink or explore the BDSM community. Now, this came about because one of you was chatting with me in the comments on one of my recent videos, and you mentioned that you were trying to explain to a friend kind of the basics of BDSM, but you noticed while trying to do that a lot of my more basic terminology focused videos are pretty old. And I can't deny that. I do have sort of an ongoing project of trying to revisit really old subjects, either by reacting to the videos or redoing the content, and like there's still so much even new stuff I haven't covered that I don't always get to take the time to make videos revisiting those older areas. So I thought what I would do today is, rather than doing like 4, 5, 6 videos going over a lot of things in detail, this is going to be a summary video, sort of a BDSM dictionary, if you want to call it that, for the top terminology that I think you should know before starting your kink journey. So let's go ahead and get into it. Number one is going to be the term BDSM, because a lot of people don't really know exactly what this means, which is totally fine, totally understandable, and it's just something that happens because a lot of people don't realize that it is actually an initialism portmanteau mashup of a bunch of different things put together. So it actually stands for bondage and discipline, or BD, dominance and submission, or DS, and sadism and masochism, or S&M. Now, underneath those labels, there are literally hundreds of possible activities, ranging from service to foot worship to flogging, and it can be really hard to get to know exactly what it is that you might be into. So one of the things that I like to recommend to people is something called the BDSMtest.org. This is really, really popular. If you have been on any kind of kinky social media, you have probably heard about it. It's not a perfect test by any means, but if you want to start to explore maybe some of the activities and titles under the BDSM umbrella that you might be into, that test can give you some good terminology to help kickstart your research. Number two is consent. Consent is the most important thing that we practice in BDSM. You always need to have explicit consent before engaging in any BDSM activities. But unfortunately, because of how mainstream society operates, a lot of us don't really have a lot of exposure or experience to what good consent looks like prior to getting into the community. For me, the model that I really like, there are many different competing ones out there, but the one that I prefer is called the FRIES model, which stands for freely given, revocable or reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. And those incorporate a lot of different things. I know it's another word that has a lot of different things in it. If you want to go into detail about what FRIES is, I do have another more recent video going over the FRIES model in detail, which I will link down below, as well as some other resources to just generally know what giving and receiving consent looks like in a positive manner, because again, it is a really big subject. But moving on to number three, we have limits and boundaries. Now, a lot of people go into BDSM thinking that when you like BDSM, you like everything in BDSM. Or a lot of people, especially submissives, think that in order to find partners, they have to have no limits and be willing to do basically anything. And that is really, really not the case. We all have things that we enjoy and things that we're not so much into. That is part of being in the realm of BDSM. I don't think anyone really truly has no limits, and the reason for that is because when you are in BDSM, almost anything can be a kink, right? Even like eating hair, even like licking the floor. There's lots of things that people don't consider could be part of the BDSM umbrella that are, and that's why figuring out limits is so important. So for example, actually with limits, let's start there. We have actually two different kinds of limits. One would be soft limits, which are things that you maybe want to try in the future or only want to do under particular circumstances, like with only one really trusted play partner. There are other things that are hard limits, which is when you definitely do not want to do something under any circumstances. Now, based off of those definitions, some people think that limits are a really static thing, and they're not. They do evolve over time, or they can evolve over time as you get more experience, learn new things, try new things, and things that used to be soft limits could become hard limits. Things that were once hard limits become soft limits, become regular everyday activities for you. It can all vary, and that is why it is important to stay in touch with yourself throughout your journey and just kind of keep up to date with what you're feeling about things as you progress along that journey. Now, the next thing that we have is boundaries, and boundaries are similar to limits. Limits are more about the particular BDSM things that you do. That could be flogging, wearing a blindfold, wearing a gag, whereas boundaries are more about the relationship you have with the other person and more general things you might do with them. So for example, a boundary might be that, hey, I have a boundary around having my neck touched, so please don't touch me in that particular area. Now, it can be really hard to understand what your limits are when you are first starting out, so I actually have, yet again, another thing to recommend. I will put a yes, no, maybe checklist down below that you can also check out, and that is a really great way of finding things that maybe sound intriguing, as well as things that are going to be a definite no. And for number 4, we have play/a scene. So in the BDSM community, when we have a particular time during which we are doing a BDSM activity, that is referred to as playing or having a scene. Now, if you are interfacing with professionals, the term you might also hear is a session, though that is less common amongst recreational BDSM practitioners. And what is in a scene varies obviously from person to person and scene to scene because there are so many things you can do. But generally, the outline of a scene looks like having some sort of pre-conversation, negotiation, establishing all of that good consent stuff. Then the time the actual activities take place, that could be anywhere from a minute, 5 minutes, a day, a whole weekend. It really varies, though I would say on average, you're going to see something between like 20 minutes to 2 to 3 hours at the most for an average BDSM experience. And then you have the wrapping up of the scene with aftercare and or a debriefing. And if those don't really make sense to you right now, some of those words maybe could be confusing, don't worry, I am going to explain all of them here in a moment. So next up, we have safe words. Safe words are probably one of the most important tools we have when we are engaging in BDSM. And the reason for that is when you are doing a scene, it's really common that someone might say, no, please stop, don't do that. But they don't actually really want the scene to be over because they maybe are egging their partner on. They're going along with the role play. It is their way of coping with the pain. Lots of different possibilities there that make the literal meaning of the words a little bit more murky. So to get around that murkiness, the tool that we have is Safewords, which is a single word that you can use to stop the scene immediately. The two most common ones would be Safeword or red, and they are meant to be respected. I do know some newer people that enjoy playing around with red or safe word, and they like to say safe word or red in a scene because it elevates that feeling of not being able to escape or get away. But especially if you want to play in public, I really recommend not doing that because at the bare minimum, it's going to be confusing for people on the outside, Or you might get your scene interrupted and be blacklisted because they are assuming your partner is violating your consent by not stopping the scene immediately. Safe words are really, really, really important, and there are multiple other ways to do them. Some people like to choose a unique word, not just red or safe word. Some people like to take it a step farther and do what is called the traffic light system, where you have red, yellow, and green. Green means good or go, yellow means slow down, check in, take a pause, etc., depending on what you negotiate yellow to mean. And then finally, red is the safe word. Now, as the final option here, we do have something else called plain English communication. And that is where no means no, stop means stop. All of those words will be taken literally. I think using both safe words and plain English communication are valid. You just need to negotiate up front for which one of the two you want and make sure you're both on the same page to avoid any confusion. Now, speaking of negotiation, that is actually our next one on the list here. And negotiation can be kind of complex, but basically what it is it is the process by which the participants in the scene come to an agreement about how the scene will happen. There are a few different key methods for how to negotiate, but the two I will be talking about here are opt-in and opt-out negotiation. Opt-in negotiation means only the things that you actively opt in for during the discussion will take place. So for example, if you say, I want to do a spanking with a collar on, the only things that will happen will be a spanking with a collar on. By contrast, opt-out negotiation means that everything is on the table except for what you exclude during the conversation. So if you say, definitely no anal, I hate blindfolds, and don't gag me, that means everything else besides those three things could happen. Generally speaking, people consider opt-in negotiation to be more consent-minded, whereas opt-out negotiations are for longer-term couples that have really built up trust and have deep mutual understanding. Now, outside of those two methodologies, negotiations are a time for figuring out the details of the scene. How will things go? What time is this going to happen? How long is it going to happen for? Where is this going to take place? What activities will this include or won't it include? What kind of emotional, physical, or sexual connection will there be? What kind of aftercare is going to be required? How do you want to interact? What kind of energy do you want to have? Do you have any medical things or triggers that maybe need to be discussed beforehand? There's literally probably a 30-part list I could write out of every single thing I think is good to negotiate about before doing a scene, and that would be very extensive, but suffice to say, it's where you really figure out all those details before doing a scene. Now, just because you negotiate doesn't mean you have to do a scene. A negotiation is just that. It is a discussion. It is not a promise you will do something. And sometimes over the course of the negotiation, you maybe get kind of like a bad feeling about something, or something just doesn't seem right, or you don't really seem like you're able to communicate with each other super well. Maybe taking time later to reflect on that, you decide you don't want to go forward with the scene. Remember, your consent is revocable at any time, and this goes doubly so for when you are negotiating for a relationship, especially a DS or dominant and submissive relationship, because a lot of people like to go up to new people and say, well, you know, I'm going to be your dom now, and act really dommy before you've done the negotiation. And even if you identify as a submissive, even if that is what you want from a relationship, that doesn't mean somebody gets to act like your dom before you have negotiated for the terms under which that would take place, if it is going to happen at all. Remember, consent is the most important thing, and that also includes DS relationships. But moving on from that particular aside, I do want to move on to the next one here, which would be subspace or topspace. So subspace or topspace is the pronounced altered state of mind that you can enter into typically when doing a BDSM scene. There are a lot of different scientific theories out there for how subspace happens or why subspace happens. So for example, with subspace, which is for the person who is receiving the activity during the scene, that will mostly feel like, for most people in my experience as well here, it's different for everyone. That feels like being floaty, being beyond the pain. It can feel like maybe you're kind of numb all over or kind of glowy and really warm, really giggly and happy, really elated. All of those really nice kind of lifting, floating, just free feelings. This may be related to something called transient hypofrontality, which is a very fun thing to look up if you like doing some scientific research. It can also be compared to things like the state you get into during a really deep meditation or something like a runner's high. Now, by comparison with topspace, that is more like entering a flow state, which is when you have a really, really deep focused immersion in something, when you are really, really in the zone. So for example, if you have ever spent a whole day working on a really enjoyable project and you haven't even noticed the hours go by, let alone anything else going on around you, that might be related to topspace. Now, with both subspace and topspace, they are things that can happen. They are not required in order to have a good scene. Again, I see a lot of newer people that get very competitive about going into these altered states of mind and thinking, well, like, I go into subspace as soon as I talk to someone. I go into subspace the moment I get flogged. It's not a competition. A lot of people, especially depending on if you have any kind of mental health issues, it can be very difficult to go into subspace, and that is fine. Some people go into it very quickly. Other people, it happens much more rarely, and both experiences are valid. It is not a competition, and you do not need to enter into subspace to have a good scene. In fact, for certain activities, it can actually take away from the experience to get into that altered state of mind because it means you're not necessarily being super present in the moment. Now, one other very key thing to know is aftercare. Aftercare is the care that you do after a scene is over. This can serve a lot of different purposes, from rebonding and reconnecting after a really intense scene. It can be coming down from subspace or topspace and mentally preparing to re-enter into everyday life. It can also be about warding off the potential negative physical or emotional repercussions from play. There are many different types of aftercare activities out there that you can do, but some of the most popular would include taking a nap, taking a hot bath or shower, having food and water, cuddling under a blanket, going for a walk, watching a comforting TV show, or just chatting. Now, again, everyone is going to be different here. Some people need a lot of aftercare, and they have a very particular routine that they follow. Other people need very little, and they just like high five, go out back and smoke a cigarette. And both things, again, are valid. It can also vary from person to person in the sense of like different scenes need different levels of aftercare. So for example, for me, after I do like bondage or pet play, I really don't need any aftercare. I'm pretty like good to go relatively soon after the scene is done. But for things like impact play, I definitely need to take more time to recover and get ready to go back into everyday existence. While most aftercare happens right after the scene is over, it can also occur the next day or the following day, especially when you are doing more intense BDSM activities. Some people have an ongoing aftercare policy where at any time after the scene is over, the person they were playing with can request aftercare. Other people, even if it's not super intense, and it's more a situation where the people are not regular play partners or don't see each other very often, they may have a policy where they always check in the next day to make sure how people are feeling, because how you feel about a scene can vary from immediately afterwards to like the next day, the next week, and so on. This can also include something called debriefing, which I mentioned earlier, which is where you talk about how the scene went, what you liked, what you didn't, what you would do differently if you're going to play together next time possibly. And that can be a really good time to give and receive feedback on both sides of the slash. All right, the next one we have here is Subdrop/Topdrop. And this one can get a little bit scientific and complicated, so just bear with me for a minute here. So when we are doing aftercare, one of the main bad things we are trying to ward off is subdrop or topdrop. And that is basically the collective term for all of the various negative side effects that can happen after you do a scene. You maybe don't realize this, but when you are doing a BDSM scene, that does involve a level of physical and or mental exertion. And just like you need a rest day after a really tough day at the gym to recover, your brain also needs time to recover from the effects of doing BDSM. And you may also need time for physical recovery as well. And when we're doing aftercare, some of the key things that a lot of people do really commonly, like staying hydrated, eating healthy snacks, making sure you're getting a lot of rest, all of that can help ward off the worst parts of subdrop and topdrop, but it doesn't necessarily get rid of it. And when you are going through subdrop or topdrop, there's a lot of different, especially mental and emotional effects that can happen. You might feel really cold, feel kind of shivery. You might feel really listless or anxious. You might have a lot of guilt or shame. You might feel down in the dumps and cry more easily or be more irritable and have a shorter fuse. You might also have headaches or muscle aches. It's a lot of different symptoms that can happen. Typically, if you're going to experience subdrop or topdrop, that starts to happen about 24 hours after the scene is done. It could be up to 48, maybe 72, depending on how intense the scene was. How long it takes for subdrop to start is proportional to how intense the scene was. So typically, the harder, the heavier the scene was, the longer it will take until you get into the subdrop area. And there's kind of a complex reason for why symptoms start the way they do and how long it takes for them to develop, which is when we're going to get into a little bit more of a scientific explanation here. So again, bear with me, please. The reason why this happens is while you're playing, you are basically producing serotonin and dopamine at higher levels than normal, which is why you get all of those warm, wonderful, gooey feelings. However, after the scene is done, your body eventually has to start metabolizing those neurotransmitters that you already created. So while it's in the process of like eating up those excess neurotransmitters, in the meantime, your brain sends out the signal, hey, we don't need as much serotonin and dopamine right now. You can kind of ease off on the production levels. And eventually, things equalize out where you have kind of taken up and metabolized all of that excess serotonin and dopamine from the scene, but your brain still has the order out to be producing less serotonin and dopamine because of the excess you produced earlier. And so you get this kind of double whammy of having two problems at once. You have that order from your brain happening, saying, hey, let's produce less of this. And then you also have the fact that you can actually basically use up the raw materials that you need in order to produce more. So that is why things like staying hydrated and eating good food, that can help with kind of warding off subdrop and topdrop, because you are basically replenishing that raw material. And that's why you can have this feeling of feeling really down in the dumps, having this kind of like almost mini depression episode, because your brain literally doesn't have enough serotonin and dopamine in it, and it's not making more. Now, eventually, you know, things do equalize out totally. You get back to your normal rate of production, but it can take a little while for that to all even out. I would say typically most people have Subdrop or Topdrop for 2 to 3 days, maybe at the most on average, for a really heavy scene where the Subdrop starts later because your dopamine high is like so much bigger to start with before you get down into the like negative territory. That would be maybe a week. I have heard of people that have extended symptoms from a scene that can last for maybe 2 weeks, even a month, though I would argue that has less to do with the chemical brain things than it does with the emotional and the psychological processes that can happen while we're doing BDSM. But finally, for the last one on our list, we have vanilla, which might seem like a weird choice for a word to end on a video about BDSM terminology, but I think it's really important. And the reason why is I have seen in some spaces, namely TikTok, let's be honest, that people use vanilla like an insult. They say, oh, you're just vanilla. Ugh, you're only into vanilla stuff. And it's so funny because it's the same thing that every like special little like clique does when they find their thing. They're like, you're not into this thing? Well, you're stupid. Like every clique does this when they're like new and young. But vanilla is not meant to be an insult. Do not use it as an insult. That is wrong, it is inappropriate, it is rude. Vanilla, as it has been used over the decades, is intended to merely be a descriptor. It is describing someone who is not into and doesn't do BDSM activities. That is all it is. It is not kinky people going, well, you know what? If you're not into BDSM, you're the worst flavor of ice cream. Like, that's not what it's about. It's actually used in other areas as well. So, for example, you maybe have heard the term vanilla software or vanilla video game, which means like an unmodified video game. It is more of a descriptor that indicates what the conventional, typical thing is, in the sense that it's like, this is the baseline, this is the average, this is the norm. And the norm, the average, is not bad. It's most people. It's the bell curve, right? You know, it's the majority of people, and kinky people just happen to generally be outside of what that norm is considered to be. So again, please, I'm begging you, do not use vanilla as an insult. It is a descriptive term. Now, if you personally do not like the term vanilla, you can also use things like non-kinky. I have also heard people use the term muggle, and let's not get into that, shall we? No. We're not going to go there, but all that being said, that is my advice and my descriptions of what I think are the basic BDSM terminology that I think you should know before getting into the community. Now, obviously, I do have a whole YouTube channel about all this, so there's so many other things to know as well, and that can be intimidating. So I would recommend starting with some of the resources and other videos that I will have linked down below. If you do have any lingering questions, things you want me to explain in more detail, something that didn't really make sense, please let me know in a comment down below. I would love to hear from you all, and if you want to make sure to not miss out on any of my other videos, you can go ahead and subscribe. I make videos twice a week about all sorts of BDSM and kink related subjects. And finally, if you want to support what I do, the best way you can do that is with Patreon. A link to that will be down below. If you do already support me over there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.